Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Mullum, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. In this episode, Dan Doran discusses retention challenges in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he focuses on two key issues: a lack of incentives for leaders to prioritize retention, and an institutional culture that prioritizes risk over results. Dan emphasizes the need for a cultural shift that embraces calculated risk and innovation. Dan Doran is the Director and National Practice Lead for Defense and Security at KPMG, and with over 2 decades of experience, he has served in the Canadian Forces, deployed to Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and held leadership roles at McGill University and WSP Canada. This is the Expert Series. So Dan, you recently wrote a piece for the CDA Institute, Retention in the CAF, Reframing the Solution. And I'd encourage people in our community to read that article if you haven't. It's very insightful. Dan, could you briefly explain perhaps the central argument of your piece and maybe touch on some of the key points for those who haven't had a chance to read it?
Yeah, sure. As the title suggests, this article is about some of the cultural factors that I feel are having negative impacts on retention in the CAF. The two key factors explored are insufficiently incentivizing formation leaders to prioritize retention and navigate other urgencies because of said prioritization. And secondly, an institutional framework not designed to address this type of crisis due to a risk and accountability culture focused on process and inputs rather than results. So in essence, the article does not solution the retention crisis because in my view, we're simply not there yet. The CAF needs to disentangle itself from the work culture challenges that do not allow it to develop the dynamic solutions required to solve retention, in addition to several other organizational challenges that the CAF is facing right now.
Well, thanks, Dan. You discussed the CAF's maybe risk-averse culture throughout your article. Could you elaborate perhaps on examples of maybe successful risk-tolerant approaches in other military organizations or perhaps industries that might serve as some kind of model for the CAF to learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so this is I love this question because I don't we don't even have to leave the CAF to answer that question, in my view. All we have to do is look at the CAF during the Second World War. So let's take Bert Hofmeister as an example, Canadian hero, general during the Second World War. So in 1939, he was deployed to the UK as a major, and by 1944. He was a major general at the age of 37. You could argue that this was war, and General Hofmeister had demonstrated success on the battlefield that led to his promotion. But irrespective, the institution back then, even in the context of a war, was willing to accept the risk of having a 37-year-old in a command of an armored division who, prior to the war, was a captain in the militia. So if we're willing to reward with rapid advancement people of brilliance manifested through behaviors centered on taking and owning calculated yet significant risks back then, why not now? The CAF also needs to socialize at the highest levels, in my view, the acceptability of failure. If said failure is a product of bold, innovative, and well thought out action. Because look, at the end of the day, not all plans are going to be successful, no matter how good they may seem, no matter how good they may look. Sometimes a plan may fail just because of bad timing or frankly, bad luck. So if the CAF has demonstrated that it has been able in the past to make this cultural risk leap, and if they can do it again, then the challenge of addressing retention, I think, can begin.
Are there elements of the CAF that are still kind of exemplified this tendency to be less risk averse, or was it something that occurred more in the past that we've kind of lost? I'm asking that a bit off the cuff, but
yeah. Well, again, like we can take examples from Kandahar when we were deployed in Afghanistan, and we had young NCOs and young officers that were taking tremendous risks in combat every day, whether it be on patrols and firefights, during Op Medusa. And these are sort of, the highest risks on the spectrum of risk when we talk about military organizations, right? Is kinetic action in combat. So I think it's the same. It's about having a similar mindset in the office and in the battlefield when it comes to managing risk and making decisions that optimize output, but do have certain risk embedded in them.
Building off my question a moment ago, Dan, how could the CAF balance the need for boldness and bold solutions with that potential for failure?
Now that's a really hard question. So you're talking mainly on the leadership side, just to foster a mindset that embraces risk-tolerant approaches. Yeah, so I mean, great question, very hard question, and one that is especially challenging for someone to answer on a podcast who's not an executive leader in the CAF. So, but I would suggest the quote from Gandhi when it comes to change, and that's be the change you want to see in the world. If executive leadership in the CAF agree with the hypothesis of this article, then they will need to take the first leap, the executive leadership, in demonstrating this type of audacity when tackling institutional challenges. My view is that will in turn drive culture change and permeate down the chain of command, especially if the successes are aggressively rewarded and the failures do not result in the implosion of the risk owner's career perspectives. There's a really good book that was written by Thomas Ricks called The Generals, and he discusses this concept of redeemable failure with generals during the Second World War and First World War, where generals would fail or senior leaders would fail, but then they would take a knee, do another job, and then typically have another chance to command or progress. So I think it's both sides of the coin when it comes to that culture change. Is of course accepting a larger risk appetite, but the institution being ready to accept failure by individuals that are audacious, and if that failure is justified based on circumstance and that it was measured risk, and all these other elements, that it wouldn't be disastrous for that individual, because that also will have an inhibiting effect on the culture of audacity when it comes to risk. If people feel that if they fail once being audacious, that they'll be done from a career point of view.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm hoping we can shift now to another element of the discussion. How would you say global trends, such as the increasing reliance on expeditionary forces, the changing nature of warfare, or even Canada's international commitments, how do these kind of issues exacerbate retention challenges in the CAF? And could Canada's specific geopolitical context necessitate tailored retention strategies?
So again, another great question. Thanks for that, Josh. But to be fair, there's a few components of that question that are probably outside my professional expertise. But what I would offer is that the needs of people who serve change generationally, but also change as people's situation change. So this means that a retention approach that worked for a 27-year-old in 2005 may not work for a 27-year-old in 2024. And what retains a 25-year-old corporal may not retain that same person when they are a 45-year-old warrant. So whatever the CAF decides, it needs to have a retention approach that is flexible enough to speak to service people where they live, as well as not be so rigid in its formulation so as to not evolve incrementally with the changing realities of CF members over time. So I also think the CAF needs to have a value proposition that effectively breaks through the social media noise, as well as the competing messaging from other potential employers. And this is not just for recruiting, but this is for recruiting and retention. There's a lot of noise out there, especially if there are serving people that are perhaps becoming more disengaged or maybe considering release. That noise, from either the social media or from competing organizations that want to hire them, become a lot more interesting. So the CAF needs to be able to break through that and be able to communicate their messaging, their value proposition to their people. And I think certainly among people that are young members or younger members of the CAF, when it comes to core motives, I think the motives of people that want to serve haven't fundamentally changed. I think people that serve, whether it was 50 years ago, 75 years ago, or today, they want a job that is challenging and they want to have impact. And I think if the CAF can effectively communicate this type of messaging internally, then I think that would go a long way in addressing framing some of the solutions for retention.
That's very insightful, Dan. So another thing your article focuses on is incentivizing leaders. So would you say, is it possible there are broader cultural or systemic factors within the CAF that might contribute to attrition, maybe such as the experience of junior members or those dissatisfied with geographical instability? And if so, how can the CAF maybe work on addressing some of these systemic factors a bit more holistically? So again, another big question that you and I aren't going to solve this issue in the length of a podcast, but we'd be curious to hear your insights on this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I think a lot of the attrition challenges can be tied to the rigidity that exists in certain parts of the current system. There are fundamental challenges that are hardwired into a life of service. Geographic instability is certainly one of them. But we no longer live in a society where the CAF member is the sole breadwinner or even the primary breadwinner in the family. And we need to think about what that means and what other factors like that mean for the CAF as an institution. So do we do enough to provide bespoke options to service people that are looking to release in an effort to retain them? And we're talking about like unhealthy attrition. If a military member is considering a release due to a posting where their spouse is a civilian doctor or dentist and requires to remain in the current geography, what can we do to convince that member to stay? Can we post them to a reserve unit in that geography? Are there telework options? I've heard of several cases anecdotally where this has been done, but I would be interested to know to what degree this is being done institutionally and what are the what impacts is it having, both positive and negative? Because certainly postings to accommodate family do exist, but then there are career implications to that. So I think that, if you have an ambitious member that needs to be accommodated, but if that is at the detriment to their career progression, that also may be a non-starter. So, not an easy road to navigate, but one that I think the CAF really does need to think about when it comes to these retention problems. And this ties back to culture, right? And going back to being able to look at change dynamically. And there's a really good book out right now that I'm reading that talks about this specifically within the Canadian Public Service. It's Donald Savoy's book, Speaking Truth to Canadians about Their Public Service. And chapter 10 is actually really, really interesting because it's titled, What Do Canadians Want from Their Federal Public Service? Or what do they want their federal public service to be? And I think the CAF would potentially find that chapter interesting, CAF leadership, by sort of asking that question in slightly different context of what what do Canadians want the CAF and D&D to be. And the author, one of the things that he notes is that if the CAF or if the public service doesn't address these culture issues when it comes to change and risk, and he touches on these as well in his book. His sort of little pithy takeaway from that is either they do it, or at some point others will come in to do it. So I think that's a fairly pointed observation by Dr. Savoy, but I think one that probably applies to the culture change challenge within the CAF in the context of attrition as well, or retention as well.
Well, thank you, Dan. Retention challenges in the military are not unique to Canada, and this is a bit of a three-pronged question, if you will. But given that they aren't unique to Canada necessarily, what lessons do you think we might be able to learn from other like-minded allies that face similar human resource challenges? And, are there any other NATO countries that have addressed similar retention and reconstitution challenges? And if so, how might their efforts to address those challenges inform solutions for the CAF?
Mm-hmm. So this is another area where my expertise is not complete, so it's certainly limited. But I have done some reading on the Australian Defence Force and their service category model. So they shifted to this, I think, a few years ago, and the ADF has developed a 7-category service model that allows for a variety of service options for individuals that want different balances of service. So I've found this. I haven't spoken to anybody within the Australian Defence Force that has lived these service categories, but certainly on paper they seem very interesting because simply they provide a number of different options for for a member of the ADF that may want to go from full-time to part-time service, may want to go to a geographically stable service category. And I haven't read anything with respect to the career implications of these choices, and that could be a pitfall of the system. So more research on my part would certainly need to be done. But I think on the surface, it certainly seems like a very interesting approach, just mainly like looking at it from a variety of choice for the member perspective. So, and on that, I think we could learn a lot from that and how we use our reserves and how we employ people in the reserves to encourage greater service periods by including finance. So when we look at the reserves, maybe there's ways of retaining them by using different financial incentives at different career milestones. For reservists, making Class A salary tax-free so as to retain a compelling value proposition for reservists later in their career when the tax take-home salary for Class A reserve service is not sufficiently compelling for the member and their family, right? So now these are things that may, be impractical on the surface because of the legislation that would need to be drafted or who knows what. But it speaks to different options that are out there where we can inspire ourselves from what other countries might be doing, and also using our own structures and systems and see what we can do. Sometimes you don't need to burn everything down to be able to make the change that could make the difference with moving the needle on retention.
And another excellent insight. Thank you. I'd like to touch on one final part as we begin to close out the discussion. Now, you're the Director and National Practice Lead at KPMG in Defense and Security. You spent a significant amount of time in the CAF as well. And so I'm wondering if I might be able to ask you for a personal reflection, based on your experiences in industry and your long time in the CAF, what kind of insights have you developed regarding recruitment and retention that might apply to this discussion?
I think on the recruiting side, the key success factor is speed, which is to say, from the first day that somebody applies to the day that you're giving them an offer. Because top talent, whether that person be walking into a recruiting center, applying for an internship or an entry-level position at KPMG or WSP, you are not the only person, you are not the only organization they are applying to. If you're a young person coming out of college, university, or high school, you are applying in many different areas, many different employers, and more often than not, the first offer you get is going to be the one that you take. So when we look at the recruiting structure in the Canadian Forces, and certainly I have to give credit to CMP and the recruiting centers in that there is certainly, we've read about it, a concerted effort to accelerate the recruiting process. I can tell you anecdotally, when we are hiring at KPMG or WSP, if we take any longer than 3 or 4 weeks from application to offer, we are losing people. And the people that we are losing are typically the first and second person that we call because they've already found another job. So when we talk about that top 2%, that top 1% of talent, they do not stay on the market long. So, when we look at a model like KPMG or WSP, where the flash to bang is 3 to 4 weeks and we lose people, our top candidates, and then you superimpose that on a CAF recruiting system that takes anywhere from 8 to 12 months to recruit, you have to think about the margin you're losing of top talent that will just simply go elsewhere. And when they get that call, they've already gotten a job. On the retention side, I think it comes to providing different models of incentivizing members, and that's what a lot of companies on the private sector side do. Is that there's many paths that one can take, whether becoming a technical expert, going on the management stream, but there's lots of ways to succeed depending on the passions of those individuals, and there's lots of ways to incentivize high performing people other than through straight promotion. And I think that's something that the CAF would benefit from exploring to a greater degree as well. And I think they've had some interesting and good success in that when we look at, say, incentives for fighter pilots or pilots in general. I think where if I'm not mistaken, there's like 10 or 12 incentive levels for the rank of captain in the RCAF if you're a pilot, captain and major, because they want those individuals that enjoy flying to be able to continue flying, but at the same time to be able to continue to see pay scale increases every year. I think that's a great model that could probably stand to be replicated in a number of other technical trades, certainly among the non-commissioned members, where you're looking at somebody who's a heavy equipment operator or a clearance diver or some other specialty, an airframe mechanic who may just enjoy turning a wrench or driving a bulldozer. But at the same time, if you're a corporal at a combat engineer regiment, I believe there's 3 or 4 incentive levels. So at a certain point, if you have a growing family with growing needs, you have to make choices, right? So I think there's solutions within the CAF that they've already applied. I think it's about looking at what's already been done and looking at scaling that and experimenting and getting feedback from members as to how these things are working. I think those would be my 2 big observations regarding where things might be a bottleneck or a pain point regarding bringing on top talent on the recruiting side, and then keeping your top talent on the retention side.
Well, Dan, thanks for sharing some of those personal reflections, and thanks also generally for just a great and insightful conversation today about recruitment and retention. Before we wrap up, I just want to give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts you have, or maybe double down on any key messages or ideas that you think might be important for our audience listening to take in and understand.
I think the key takeaway, if you get nothing else from this podcast and the article, I would say it really comes down to risk culture and change culture. And if the CAF can navigate those two to be able to really reflect on managing risk as opposed to eliminating risk in their decision-making process. And again, be output focused as opposed to process and input focused. That's where things are going to be able to change. And the imagination and dynamism of the leadership within the CAF will be able to really thrive in that kind of environment, because I know a lot of these individuals, certainly at the lieutenant colonel and colonel level, and these are incredible human beings that work incredibly diligently. They love the Canadian Forces. They love serving their country. And I think if you can give them that opportunity to use all that creativity in their brains, that they'll really be able to move the yardstick forward.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to Dan Doran, both for his article on recruitment and retention, which you can find on our website, and for making time for the podcast. Until next time.